Thank you, everyone. And still it's good morning. So, Professor Ramana, Professor Dash, thank you very much. It's an absolute honor to be back in the Institute after almost 15 years. And I was subconsciously still taking notes when you were speaking. So, I think it doesn't know. I'll be brief. We have next, I think, another session of 1 hour. So, we'll stick to the format, which is the history of crisis, what led to it, and can be prevented. I'll start on a gloomy note, and we'll work up from there. Personally, I don't think we can prevent the next crisis. Human beings have a remarkable ability to innovate, and we have a remarkable ability to innovate in failing as a system, individually and otherwise. So, the next crisis will never be the same as the current crisis. But we can take certain pointers. I'll not go into the history of crisis, which I think the first one documented is the tulip crisis in Amsterdam. For us, it's ridiculous now that people are paying so much for tulips. I don't know how romantic they were at that time. But basically, what, in my opinion, are what I call indicators of what leads to crisis is 2-3 key factors. Misallocation of capital, and we can discuss the incentives and the disincentives for that. Misallocation or misjudgment of risk. Thirdly, forgetting history, which we all tend to do. And fourthly, one factor which has kind of emerged is what I call the opacity of certain markets, which unfortunately leads us to understand the crisis at a pretty late stage. Now, misallocation of capital is pretty standard actually, and that's why what has happened this time around it feels larger, because this time it was a debt crisis. And we all know debt typically happens to be a larger part of the balance sheet for governments, banks, everyone, and that's why this crisis feels deeper. Also, this crisis germinated, or at least was germinated in relatively opaque markets of what exotic products which was launched. You had products like swaps are not, or at least are not well traded, unlike your equities and to some extent your debt. So the signals for either regulators or otherwise was not very apparent as to what was happening. Markets, the good thing about a well-functioning market is it lets people give signals, and that was missing in this crisis. So, and as we'll debate in the second session as to how the misallocation of capital led probably to this. To put some numbers in perspective, the S&P decade return was 0 for the last year. Now imagine you have been told in your entire life that equities is where you make long-term wealth, and suddenly you realize at the end of 2010, you know what, I'm not richer because I put money in equity markets. And I think that's why we'll debate in the second half as to this question which has been raised as to does finance create value? Because it seems it has not created value for a larger number of people. Second one, as I said, is misallocation of risk, and here we all tend to forget, in my opinion, when I say we, I mean everyone, that at some point we have learned, I think Dr. Panika and Mr. Everyone taught us, there is a systemic risk, and the systemic risk can only be transferred, it cannot be reduced. We all were under the impression that systemic risk reduced during that crisis. As Manoj talked about subprime, we were lending to the subprime borrowers at a price which we thought was the right risk, and then those loans which in effect were riskier were transferred to this government agencies like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and we all thought, the private sector thought, that guess what, I have given the risk to them, so it doesn't matter, Suddenly you realize that's not true. What has happened is those organizations failed, and in relation, ultimately the private banks also had to be rescued or bailed down. It's actually playing out, I would say right in front of our eyes in the European credit crisis. You had a bunch of European banks, which were kind of thinly capitalized, and suddenly saw that they were seen as weak banks. To prevent the bank failures, you had the governments come and inject money into them, either in some way, bail out the banks. And now what has happened is the governments have actually become more riskier. So what has happened is the risk just got transferred from the private sector bank balance sheets to the public sector government balance sheets, and in time through higher tax will come onto the household balance sheets. So I think the basic issue is we tend to think that risk has come off, and that did not. In fact, most of the banks, what happened internally was correlation models failed. we all thought that certain markets which are not supposed to be correlated, currency and equities, debt and some other markets, they actually all correlated, the correlations went up. So you were modeling, you were pricing your products based on historical correlations, and suddenly you realize they don't hold true anymore. So, which is why I said we tend to forget history. And again, finally, what can we do to prevent it? I think a lot of people have talked about it. Managerial risk, remuneration obviously was a big issue. As Manoj talked, there was an explicit encouragement by the governments, which in effect led to the private sector behave in the manner in which they behave. What is being done, and I think, for example, the Basel III norms, it could be very intricate. End of the day, what Basel III does is someone is saying your cost of business needs to increase, which means you need to hold more equity. It's as simple as that. So what is happening in Basel III is all the banks will be forced to hold more equity, in which means, and this is classic viewpoint, you have less leverage, which means you will make less returns if you price the product in the same manner as you did in the past. Very simple. So what the regulators are trying to do is to increase the, let's call the equity, or at least incentivize the firms to behave in a more risk-averse manner than they had done. That same thing is going to play through in other objectives. But there is, and I must say, the reason why I started by saying I'm gloomy about it is, it's not easy to prevent crisis because of organizational inertia. Just a few days back, I don't know if I'm sure you guys have seen, there is this whole market called the US money market funds. It's a very large market. A lot of people see it as a safe avenue, as a lot of retail people. So funds are invested in the market, and those funds are seen as very, very let's call it risk-free returns. Actually, what we have had is, up until now, is return-free risk, to be honest, not risk-free return. So, but anyway, those money market mutual funds are seen as very safe avenues. After the crisis, there has been a big concerted effort to regulate those money market mutual funds. There was a proposal that those funds will be regulated somewhere like banks, because that's what they were doing. They're not really mutual funds in the true sense. Unfortunately, the regulation did not go through. The SEC was forced to back down on actually doing that. And there were very powerful, let's call it lobbying forces or otherwise in place, which prevented that from happening. So right in front of our eyes, 5 years down the crisis, there are still actors within the government and the private sector and otherwise, which are not incentivized to change things, status quo. And finally, and we'll debate this in the second half, is this whole obsession of shareholder value. I think shareholder value, we all at least believe, is only two things. At one level, it was equity share price going up, and secondly, from a perspective of company, it was if your reserve or shareholder equity actually went up in your balance sheets. What we suddenly realized was the P&L was wrong. You were actually not making the profits which you thought you were making, because you were not allocating for the risk which was there. Over the last 5, 6, if you were working in a bank, over the last 8 years, you'll notice if you go to the P&L of most banks, it's the debt markets or the debt market parts of the bank which have made huge money. Okay, that's the P&L story. Unfortunately, what you now realize is those money was not right. What you made was not right, because now you're seeing the impact of that risk. You're having to take charges against the previous decisions which you have made, and suddenly if you restate the P&L and the balance sheet of a lot of banks over a 10-year period, probably a lot of divisions which were seen as being profitable are actually not profitable. So, a host of factors, host of issues, but I'll leave you with one more, as I final thought that we should debate is, does finance create value? Ironically, when I was here, this question is to be asked about advertising, not about finance, So good, we have traveled a long way on that. Finance does create value. In fact, I'll take 30 seconds on this. Post-Lehman, the 6 months after Lehman was actually the best period for you to understand that finance does create value. Because what happened for the 6 months, that lot of markets shut down. Finance as an industry literally came to a standstill in a very, very physical terms, which means banks stopped transacting between themselves and banks stopped transacting with their clients. At the basic, what happened was, you need two things to happen. Forget about, the basic thing a bank does, it takes savings and converts into capital, equity and debt both. That process stopped. More importantly, trade. you like it or not like it, you will have global trade, and global trade requires a global financial system. And that stopped. In fact, you will notice if you go back and see, the trade basically came to a halt. Not because people did not want to buy things. In America people still wanted to buy, or in Europe people still wanted to buy. It's just that those companies could not ship the products because there was no finance available. So we'll discuss it again in detail. As I said, go back to my key point. We can't prevent the next crisis. It will happen in a different market, in a different form. What we can do is try and contain the impact of that. You will notice equity markets always have crises. That's why there's a Chapter 11 bankruptcy code. You had the tech crisis in a way, the Silicon Valley crisis. It played out only in the equity markets. Equity markets are typically the most transparent of markets, so the system adjusted the fastest. What happened here was debt market crisis, sovereign bond crisis. These are markets which are not so apparent and transparent. So that's all I will leave you with. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, and hopefully we'll have a very vigorous time for questions. Thank you.